Yeah, NGO Monitor began a little over 10 years ago. It was started by Professor Gerald Steinberg, who is a professor of political science at Bar Ilan University here in Israel. Um, he, um, he took notice of what was happening at the Durban Anti-Racism Conference in 2001. There were two conferences. One was the governmental and one was the non-governmental organization forum, or the NGO forum. The NGO forum had several thousand NGOs that were present, and they passed a resolution calling essentially for a global isolation of Israel, meaning to isolate Israel completely, militarily, economically, diplomatically, culturally, in every possible way to isolate Israel. The language that was used to describe Israel was a language of demonization and the language of delegitimization, to remove the legitimacy of the state of Israel, comparing Israel to apartheid era South Africa, comparing Israel, making Israel to be equivalent to apartheid and to be equivalent to even Nazi Germany. We hear that in the propaganda quite a bit. The whole purpose is, just as Nazi Germany and just as apartheid South Africa were illegitimate entities and did not, should not have existed because of their racism and oppression. So by repeating over and over and over and over again the lie that Israel is an apartheid state, that Israel is a racist state, and so on, by repeating it, they create this echo chamber and create this image of Israel being non-legitimate and should cease to exist. That is their goal. That is ultimately the goal of this effort. So NGO Monitor was started because the network that is pushing this agenda, it's a global network of non-governmental organizations that are leading this effort. And one of the things that we are not only studying and reporting and taking action against is that many of these NGOs, many of these NGOs, receive funding, in many cases the bulk of their funding, from governments. So these non-governmental organizations are receiving millions and millions of euros from governments, and it's mostly European governments, of course. So the way that the mechanism, the funding mechanism, the way that the funding mechanism works is that the European governments take their money, their humanitarian overseas aid money, and they give it to Christian aid societies. So that could be like, let's take the UK for instance. The British government gives a chunk of change to Christian Aid, which is a major funding charity in the UK. Christian Aid will then pass out that money, give the money to NGOs around the world doing humanitarian work. But when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the kinds of money that flows from the British government to Christian Aid to the NGOs, it goes to organizations that are highly politicized, very biased. They call themselves human rights organizations, but what they are really is that they're political advocacy organizations fighting for the cause for the destruction of the state of Israel. One of the organizations is an Israeli organization called Zochrot, which means memory in Hebrew. It's made up of maybe a dozen or a few dozen individuals. It has no local constituency whatsoever. It has no funding that comes from Israel. I think about 99% of its funding comes from overseas, and about 93% of the funding comes from Christian organizations. And what Zochrot stands for, what they want to do, is they are opposed to Israel's existence as a Jewish state. They support the right of return of all Palestinian refugees and their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and they call for a one-state solution. So they have no local Israeli support, so they have to rely on foreign support. So, in most of that foreign support comes from a variety of Christian churches: Christian Aid, Diaconia, ECO, and Crick and Akci, and other Christian aid organizations in Europe. It's complex. It's very complex, and let's just take the Presbyterian Church as one example. So the Presbyterian Church has a long history of involvement in this region. The Presbyterian Church sent missionaries to the Middle East in the 19th century, and there are a lot of institutions here in the region which are Presbyterian connected. The American University in Beirut, the American University in Cairo, and so on. So there's a very strong Presbyterian presence in this region. Other Protestant denominations, similarly, the mainline denominations, have these kinds of connections to the region. And the early years of Israel's existence, one of the complaints that Israelis had was that the State Department itself was anti-Israel. The State Department opposed President Truman recognizing the newly found state. And that was because there was a group of Arabists in the State Department, and most, if not all of them, had been the children of these missionaries who spoke Arabic, and they were very familiar with the region, and so they were put in charge of the region, and they had a natural affinity for the Arab side of the conflict. Okay, but that so a lot of these mainline churches have these roots within the region. Then there's a Palestinian Christian community. It's mostly Greek Orthodox or Roman Catholic and so on. But at the same time, the Palestinian Christian community many have bought into or are part of the Palestinian national movement. Now, there's a gentleman by the name of Naim Atik who leads an organization called Sabil. He founded the organization in the late 80s, early 90s. Sabil promotes something called Palestinian liberation theology. And what Naim Atik did was very clever and very, very, very brilliant. And as far as I'm concerned, it was a brilliant stroke. And that was to marry Palestinian nationalism to Christian theology, and calling it Palestinian liberation theology. Now, liberation theology is very popular. It's very trendy within a number of seminaries, mainline seminaries. Of course, it began in Latin America and is more familiar to Catholics than Protestants. So Pope John Paul banned involvement of Catholic clergy in political movements because, well, he came from a communist country, and liberation theology was more closely akin to communism than to Catholicism, and so there was a backlash by the church against that. But it has since taken liberation theology has since taken a popular turn in a lot of Protestant mainline seminaries, Presbyterians, Episcopalian, the UCC, and so forth. And so what Naim Atik did was he married Palestinian nationalist ideology to Christian liberation theology, and now, many years later, he's been very successful in essentially bringing the gospel of Palestinian liberation theology to a lot of mainline churches. And these, what we are seeing within these churches is straightforward advocacy by activists within these churches for Palestinian nationalist goals. And it's no mistake that Sabil calls for a one-state solution, that Sabil supports BDS. The Kairos Palestine document, which was published in 2009, also supports BDS. It vilifies and demonizes Israel. It promotes the theology of supersessionism, and all toward the goal of delegitimizing any Jewish historical or religious claim to any part of the land of Israel whatsoever. That is how they succeeded in taking a nationalist ideology, which most, if not all, mainline Protestant churches have an abhorrence to nationalism, but they were able to take Palestinian nationalism, wrap it around with a theological sugarcoating, and a number of members of these churches have been swallowing this pill for a number of years, and now they have become essentially advocates for one particular nationalist movement. So Christ at the Checkpoint, in its promotions, talks about wanting to dialogue with both peoples, okay? And so they invite Palestinian Christians, and the only Israeli Jews that they invite are Israeli Jewish believers in Jesus. 99.9% of Israeli Jews are not Christians. And so when they're having a dialogue, they're having a dialogue within a very tight echo chamber. And they're cutting out Israelis from the dialogue, from the discussion, okay? So it's intellectually dishonest to say that they're having a dialogue with Israelis. They are not. When you look at their program, they bring their delegates and the participants. They go to the separation barrier, which they call the apartheid wall. They go to visit East Jerusalem. They don't come to Western Jerusalem. Okay, I would love to invite them to come to my office, but if I were to take them to my office, the first thing I would do is I would say, please come, let's have lunch at Café Paris. Why would I invite them to Café Paris? It's in the same building as my office. Well, because Café Paris used to be called Café Moment, Café Moment, right? The Moment Café. And the Moment Café was bombed by a suicide bomber around 14 years ago, killed 15 or 16 people there, and right there on the restaurant today, there's a plaque with the names of the victims of the suicide bombing. So I would love for these folks to come to this spot, to pray for the souls of the people who were murdered there, and to pray for the families who survived them, as well as pray for peace among Palestinians and so on. If you don't do that, if you're only looking at one side and praying for peace for only one side and wishing nothing but anger and hatred toward the other, you're not a peacemaker. So Christ at the Checkpoint is not about peacemaking. It's about actually promoting demonization against Israel. And so the question I would have for Christians who are involved in trying to support BDS, who want to demonize the state of Israel, who even want to bring the state of Israel down, okay? My question is, does that make you a peacemaker? You're not adding to peace. You're encouraging conflict. You're encouraging hatred. There's enough hatred in this region. My God, there's enough hatred in this region. Do we need any more? Do we need outsiders from the United States or Europe coming here and encouraging hatred? I think there's a special role for Christians who don't live here to act as a bridge and not to take sides and to push in a direction that leads to more conflict and more bloodshed and more hatred. Just as Naim Atik was able to bring Palestinian nationalist ideology into mainline Protestant churches, Sami Awad of the Bethlehem Bible College, who's also the founder of the Holy Land Foundation, was able to take a similar concept and wrap a evangelical theological base around it, which also coincided with a newer generation of evangelical Christians who are rebelling to some degree against their parents' form of faith and belief, and are pushing for a more social justice, social action kind of agenda. And what's happening is that the Christ of the Checkpoint, which is a manifestation of the Bethlehem Bible College, they're latching onto that generation, onto those ideas, and are, once again, they're sugarcoating Palestinian nationalism, wrapping it into a theological coating, and injecting it into the evangelical churches, and the younger generations are beginning to eat these pills and are now taking on Palestinian nationalist ideology. So we're beginning to hear in evangelical circles now demonization of Israel, and so on. Yeah, I mean, the message that is given at Christ at the Checkpoint, it's very similar in some ways to the message that Sabeel gives, but it's more tuned to an evangelical audience. The message, first of all, at the theological level, there's an effort to revive replacement theology, to describe Jews as having lost favor with God because after the destruction of the temple, it was a punishment for not believing in Jesus, and therefore any national rights that Jews may have had in the land of Israel or the land of Judea were forfeited. Okay, and that's a major part of classic Christian teachings. And after World War II, a lot of Christian theologians began to look at the teachings within their faith regarding Jews and Judaism, and found that there was what they called a teaching of contempt towards Jews and Judaism that in many ways fed into a lot of hate that led ultimately to the Holocaust. And so that was a very serious attempt by many Christian theologians, and it's still going on, to look at the theology and say, what is it that's in the teaching that could have led to this type of outcome? What's going on here is that, look, the Palestinian national movement has a national agenda, and that agenda is to deny the right of the Jewish people to any part of Palestine, to deny the right of the Jewish people to any national sovereignty in any part of this country. And when you add a theological element to that, a Christian theological element to that, the strongest point that you can make is that the Jews are rejected by God and have no national rights whatsoever, and therefore don't belong here, and Israel should cease to exist. Now, once you start injecting theology into that kind of conflict, well, that first of all, you're adding to the conflict. You're adding to the hatred. You're adding to the bigotry, and you're not making peace. You're not looking to find common ground with the Jewish people. What you're trying to do is deny them, trying to dehumanize them, and that is something which I think Christ at the Checkpoint has been doing. There have been speakers there who have talked about how Israeli Jews, who are half of Israeli Jews, are Ashkenazi, from European descent. Well, they're not really Semites, they're actually Khazars, okay, and therefore they have no right to live here. Well, my God, when I hear that argument, a racial definition of Jews, where have we heard that before? Okay, and now we have Palestinian Christians who are pushing that agenda, and there are now some American Christians who are echoing that and racializing Jews, just like the Nazis did. And this whole idea that Jews are not Semites and don't deserve to live here, well, I would just ask the question, excuse me, we were Semitic enough to be murdered by the millions, and now we're not Semitic enough to live in the Middle East? Pardon me, but that is racism. And if you take on that argument, then there's very little difference between that argument and the Nazi argument. It is an anti-Semitic argument. It is thoroughly anti-Semitic. And it's also not true on top of it all. But that's, I mean, this is where the mythologies, there's so many mythologies about Jews and Judaism in Israel that exist in today's world that's been built upon by centuries of other mythologies, and they morph into different shapes. And when you marry theology to nationalism, that's what you get. And that's what's been going on with the Palestinian liberation theology, whether it's coming from Sabeel and going into mainline churches, whether it's coming from Christ at the Checkpoint and going into evangelical churches. Well, another major part of the campaign against Israel is utilizing multimedia, whether it's films or internet or YouTube or what have you. And so with God on Our Side is one example of how this narrative, this marriage of Palestinian nationalism with Christian theology is making it into the multimedia area. And so this film, it's very easy to either download or get a DVD and bring it to a church and show it. It's this film is extremely one-sided. It doesn't in any way portray the conflict in any truthful manner. It sidesteps many issues, and it basically objectifies Jews and Judaism, and tells a false history of the founding of the State of Israel, and so on. It's a propaganda film. It should be seen as such. Critical thinking should not be checked in as you walk into your church. You should view the film with a jaundiced eye. If the film is being shown at your church, then you should demand to ask for the other side to be heard. It's not. This is just because it's made by Christians and evangelicals doesn't mean that it's an objective film. The film is by and large a propaganda film promoting a particular nationalist agenda. And if that's what you want to do, then fine, but be honest about it. We had this distributed last year at the Presbyterian General Assembly. The vote was only, the vote for divestment won by 7 votes out of a 600 something. It was a very narrow victory. If I can, so what we wanted to demonstrate to Presbyterians, to consider some of the other issues that are going on here. And we talked about BDS and why BDS is anti-peace and who's pushing the BDS agenda within the churches, and so on. Now, just to take as a case study, the Presbyterian Church, like many church bodies, they're democratic. They're very flat, meaning that it's not hierarchical like the Catholic Church or the Episcopalian Church. It's very flat. And so every 2 years they have a General Assembly where a lot of issues are debated and discussed, and a lot of them are theological issues where the laity has almost as much, if not as much, say as the clergy on theological matters. Now, it's also a very political body. It's run in a very political fashion. It's run like a parliament. The Presbyterian Church in many ways served as a template for the United States Congress. The way that the whole plenum is run, it's a very democratic process. And like any democracy, there are caucuses, there are lobbies. One of the lobbies in the church is called the Israel-Palestine Mission Network. And this is a group of Presbyterians who have come together to lobby for divestment, to lobby for a BDS. They are very radical in their viewpoints, and they were the primary grouping within the Presbyterian Church pushing for divestment. We did a report last year, it's on our website, which highlighted the role that anti-Semitism played in the divestment campaign within the Presbyterian Church. We had access to their Facebook page, a closed Facebook page, in which they were talking among themselves, and they thought they were talking among themselves, and so they let loose. So they weren't careful about what they were saying. They weren't on camera. They weren't being quoted by a reporter. They weren't issuing press releases. They were talking among themselves. And the things that were being said by this Presbyterian group or members of this group would make, I don't know, David Duke or Adolf Hitler very comfortable. The Jews control the media, the Jews control the government, the Zionists are trying to take over the world. They were praising Press TV, which is the Iranian-owned press company, because Iran is the only country in the world that is Zionist-free. I mean, that's an exact quote, and you can download the report from our website. we published all this material. We sent it to the Presbyterian Church, to their church leaders in Kentucky. Got no response. No response whatsoever. They buttoned up their lips. They circled the wagons and said nothing about this very horrific bigotry. The IPMN, the Israel-Palestine Mission Network, is still able to use the Presbyterian Church's nonprofit status to raise funds for its efforts. Now, what if this had been a body within the church that the members were secretly making horrific racist statements about African Americans, for instance, and then they were outed? Would the church take a stance of no stance? Of course not. The church would close them down in an instant. But anti-Semitism gets a pass. And unfortunately, that's the reality in today's world, is anti-Semitism gets a pass in many different circles. And look, you know, the reason why Israel came into existence was because of anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism didn't go away. It may have gone underground for a while, but certainly what we're seeing in Europe is absolutely horrific. And that's why we have Israel. That's why we have Israel. So that the anti-Semites can fume and scream all they want, but there's something called the Israeli Defense Forces that they're going to have to get by if they ever want to put their agenda back into power. Otherwise, you know, we're not going there again. No more ghettos, no more gas chambers, no more being a scattered minority everywhere, vulnerable to everything. We defend ourselves now. And if you don't like the fact that Jews defend themselves, then I'm sorry, I have no apologies for that.